Occasionally, we'll knit a gauge swatch that we just love. The fabric is perfect, the needle and the yarn combination just works for us. However, the stitch gauge is just slightly off from what the pattern calls for. I'm gonna share with you my method for choosing the sweater size from the pattern based on that gauge swatch. And as a bonus, I'm also going to be including an alternative increase technique for the Felix pullover if you should decide not to use the eyelet increases. So if you would like to avoid having the eyelets down the raglan seams and you want a nice clean raglan seam, I will share with you how I did that with my own Felix. So grab your knitting and maybe a notebook and let's get started. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the Wool Needles Hands Midweek Ramble. For this ramble, I think it's going to be a short one, pretty concise, but I wanted to share with you guys a little pointer for choosing the size in a pattern to knit if your gauge swatch is a little off, or if you just really happen to love what you're getting with your gauge swatch and the needles, the yarn, and all of that, despite the fact that you're a little off. I have on a few different occasions, actually currently with my Versal pullover, I knit my gauge swatch and the gauge was off ever so slightly. I don't know if it was off ever so slightly, but it was off enough to, it was just off. So I was gonna have to make some adjustments, but I really loved the fabric that I was getting, the yarn combination, the needle. I didn't wanna sacrifice any of that. And if you have a situation like that, or if you really just don't wanna knit more than one gauge swatch and you wanna knit the one gauge swatch and count your stitches and see what your gauge is and just move on from there, this technique can help you do that. So some things that we're gonna need today and that you might wanna, if you're gonna follow along with me or later on down the road, you're definitely gonna need a notebook. I am going to be using the information that is provided to us on the Ravelry page for the Felix pullover. Since we're all working on Felixes right now for the Felix for Fall Knit Along, I'm gonna be using that. And then I will be using one element from the actual paid for pattern. However, the element that I'm gonna be using is so minor that it doesn't give away anything from the pattern. And if anything, it makes knitting this pattern that much more approachable because I'm going to offer you some advice for how to go about choosing the right size for you based on your swatch. So there will be one small detail from the pattern that you don't see on the Ravelry page that I'm going to include here. I don't think that it's a big deal in terms of giving away any secrets to the pattern at all. I think it's necessary for me to share this method with you guys. So what I have here with me today is my tablet. I have it open to Procreate where I'm going to take some notes. I'm going to do a screen recording so that you can see what I'm doing down here on my tablet and how I'm coming up with the size of sweater to knit based on a swatch that I have here. You can follow along with me or just hang on to this, and then when it is time for you to determine which size sweater to knit, come back to it and use this to help you figure that out. The math is pretty simple. I'll run it down for you here. You might want a calculator just to make things easy. But yeah, grab a notebook, grab a pencil, or just grab your knitting and watch, and we'll go from there. Now, the first thing that you have to do this is you do have to have a swatch. You don't need a perfect swatch. It doesn't need to be a 4x4 swatch. It just needs to be enough of a swatch that you can get a general idea of your stitch gauge. With this particular design, the Felix pullover, it is a top-down design. You can adjust the length of almost every aspect of this sweater, so row gauge is really not that important here. Some people might chime in the comments to disagree with me, and I fully respect that because I know that there are arguments that would say actually row gauge is very important, and I get that. But for what we're doing today, for all intents and purposes, row gauge is just really not that important here, and what we're focusing on is our stitch gauge to give us a jumping off point and to give us a size to start with the pattern, if our gauge swatch is not on point. If you have a gauge swatch that's knitting to the gauge that the pattern calls for, then you just go on and do the size that's right. However, again, this is if your gauge swatch is not knitting to gauge, but yet you really want to stick with what you have here. You don't want to have to like up your needle size, change your yarn, all of that. That's kind of what we're working with today. So you're gonna need a gauge swatch. This is my swatch. This is nothing fancy. And I will be honest, you could wash it and block it the way that you're gonna do the sweater. I don't do that. I don't have the patience for that part of it. I think I've done that once before. I didn't do that with this. Now, yeah, that would be ideal. So go ahead and do that if that fits for you. But in the case of this, I did not do that here. So we'll just go forth knowing that. But I do have my swatch. There's enough stitches on here to give me an idea of what I'm working with here, of what, something to count. So I need this. Now, if we have a gauge swatch, we're assuming that we actually have the pattern with us. So you are gonna need the pattern. You're gonna need the actual pattern, not just the Ravelry page, because that's gonna give you some important information to help you figure out which size to choose or which size to knit based on your gauge swatch. So you might want to have that on hand. Again, we're talking about the Felix pullover, so that is the pattern that I'm going to be using for this particular tutorial, if you will. Okay, let's go ahead and go down to my tablet down here. I'm going to start taking notes for the other elements that we're going to need. We know that we're going to need our swatch and we're going to need our bust circumference, all of this information. So I'm going to put down bust size 34 inches. This is my bust size. Everybody's bust size is slightly different. Another thing that I didn't mention is you're also going to want to know how much ease you desire for this particular project. And for me, I'm kind of sticking to what the pattern calls for, and I want roughly 7 inches of ease. That's just my choice. That's kind of what the pattern is. That's what the sample on the pattern, the model shows. And that's what I'm going for here too. Okay, now that we have our bust and our ease, I'm going to want to write down what my stitch gauge is. So I take my swatch, I measure out 4 inches, and I count how many rows of stitches that I can get within 4 inches. And you want to kind of be as accurate as possible. If you're noticing that it's like, you know, a half number or a quarter of a stitch at the end, you want to incorporate that. So make sure that you take into consideration, it doesn't have to be precisely a quarter or precisely a half of a stitch, but you get what I'm saying. If you notice that maybe a half of a stitch kind of comes into the measurement, you're going to want to include that. Don't round down, don't round up. Try to be as precise as you possibly can. So based on my swatch over here, my gauge, my handwriting on this is really horrible, and it's because of the way that the pencil works, so pardon me. My gauge is 13 stitches to 4 inches. I got kind of lucky there. I didn't have any like oddball stitches in there. Now, in order to determine how many stitches per inch I'm getting, I'm going to want to divide 13 by 4. And when I do that, that's going to tell me how many number of stitches I get in 1 inch. And that is 3.25 stitches per inch. Now this is my single stitch gauge. That's going to be really important moving forward. So we have our bust, we have our desired ease, we have our gauge, and we have our stitch gauge. Really important. Now we're ready to move on to the next kind of section of figuring out which size we're going to be knitting. Okay, this is the part where I share with you a little piece of the inside of the pattern that you don't have access to if you're looking at the Ravelry page. Again, this is not going to reveal anything secret to you about the pattern. It's going to tell me how many stitches you have in the bust of your sweater after you separate for the sleeves for each of the sizes provided in the sweater pattern. Okay, so I'm going to write this down. Based on all of the different sizes provided, after you separate for the sleeves, and you have to find this in the pattern, you want to find out how many stitches remain for the body after you separate for the sleeves. And in this design, for the smallest size, there are 136 stitches. For the medium size, or the second size, 152, and then it goes to 168, 184, and 200. Okay, that's it. That's the only thing I'm going to be giving away from the inside of the pattern, and that's because I want to help make this accessible to you when it comes to determining sizes. Okay, now that I have that information, this is body stitches right here, total number of body stitches. I need to figure out which one of those is going to be best for me based on my single stitch gauge or my gauge. Okay, now the way that we're going to do this is we're going to start with the smallest size first, because we might as well start with the smallest size and work our way up until we find the size that gives us that ease or closest to the ease that we're looking for. So I'm going to be starting with the 136 stitches. Now, I know that I am getting 3.25 stitches per inch, or 3¼ stitches per inch, and this is 136 stitches. I want to know how many inches 136 stitches would be based on my stitch gauge. So what I'm going to do is divide 136 stitches by the 3.25 stitches that I get per inch. And when I do that, I'm going to get 41.8 inches. That is what my bust circumference is going to be after I separate for sleeves if I'm using the yarn and the needles that I have in this swatch here to make this sweater. So 41.8 inches of bust is going to give me 7.8 inches of ease. Okay. Now we know that my desired ease is 7 inches, and this is going to give me 7.8 inches. There's no need for me to continue to a higher value because that's already an 8/10 of an inch more than what I'm looking for. However, this is the smallest value, so I either have to decide to sacrifice that 8/10 of an inch and just say it's close enough to 7 inches. I'm going to knit the smallest size. Or because there is no size smaller than that that's already written out in the pattern, and because I have no interest in modifying the pattern to that extent, I have to decide if I'm going to go down a needle size or change my yarn. Now, let's say, for example, that I wanted more ease. Let's say that instead of the 7 inches of ease I thought that I actually would like something closer to 10 inches. Sometimes people like 10 inches in their sweaters. It gives them that really oversized kind of boxy feel. Okay, well, this isn't going to work for me because this is 7.8 inches. I need more ease than that. So I'm going to try this next size, which is 152 body stitches divided by my 3.25 stitches per inch. And that's going to give me 46 7/10 or 46.7 inches of body circumference, which actually gives me 12 inches of ease. Okay, so you have some considerations to make here. There is no in between. You have 7.8 inches of ease or you have 12 inches of ease. You don't really have that happy medium if you're looking for 10 inches of positive ease. There are some choices that you can make here. Again, you can sacrifice the yarn and do something different, or you can go down a needle size, up a needle size. You kind of have to make that consideration. Or if you think that 12 inches of positive ease is going to work for you, then you're fine. But for the case of my size choice here, I would just go with the smallest size, knowing that it's going to get me the closest to my desired ease for this sweater. Okay, now that you have that information and you know that the first or second value, or whichever value in that lineup of bust stitches, once you know which one of those correlates to the most appropriate size for you, that's going to tell you which size sweater you're going to be knitting. So when I look at this, I'm going to change my color here. Let's go a little bit brighter. I'm sweating, you guys. Holy smokes. So when I look at this, I know that this correlates to my size because it is giving me the closest to my desired ease. So that means that I will be knitting the smallest size of the sweater. Now, if maybe it's different for you, maybe you notice that this is going to correlate to your desired ease, you're going to be knitting the third size of the sweater. That would be how you determine, based on your swatch, which size of sweater is going to be right for you and what's going to get you closest to your desired ease. Now, I'm going to mention this again because this isn't fail-safe, this isn't perfect. There's going to be situations where you just can't get what you want in terms of your ease. You just can't get close enough. You just can't get, it just doesn't work out. Kind of like if I was really stuck on 10 inches of ease here, I would kind of have to make some sacrifices. I mean, 2 more inches of positive ease can make a big difference to a person. So in that case, that's where you really have to bite the bullet and say, okay, I have to change my yarn. I have to change my needle size. I have to do something like that. And I have to reknit my gauge swatch so that I know moving forward which size I'm going to be doing. But if you try this first with a swatch that you really love, then you kind of, bypass that and you have a way to knit the sweater. You kind of have a way to get what you want without having to do all the extra legwork. But like I said, there is a chance that you're going to have to do some extra legwork regardless. But 7.8 inches of positive ease in my case, that's close enough. It's close enough to 7 inches of ease. I've knit sweaters with more ease than that I love. So that's a sacrifice that I'm willing to make. And I'm pretty confident for most of us, we have options here without having to change the needle and the yarn or making things more complicated than necessary. But again, I mean, that's not super complicated in and of itself. We do it all the time. We notice that our needle is just getting us a gauge that's too large, so we're going to just go down a needle size. It's not that complicated. But if you're married to your swatch and you really want to keep things the way they are in the swatch, this is a technique for you. Over on the Ravelry page for the podcast group, I will leave a thread over there that will have this information in it. And you can just access that if you want, do a screenshot, print it out, whatever it is, so that all this information is there for you if you would like to go back and access that later. Okay, now I did say that I was going to include a little bonus tip in here for you guys. I've been talking to folks regarding the short row shaping and the raglan increases for the Felix pullover. A lot of you guys are, the word's not trepidatious, but you just aren't super interested in the eyelets that form the raglan increases for the Felix pullover, partly because you just don't like them aesthetically or because they're complicating things when it comes to short rows. I know that a lot of you guys are using this as a first-time sweater knit, and sometimes that added complication of the way the increases are executed with the eyelets paired with the short rows, that can just add a level of complication that you're just not interested in. And there is a workaround, and I'm gonna share that with you here. Okay, before I share that though, I'll show you what I mean by not having eyelets. This is the third Felix that I knit. I knit this with one strand of Platelope and one strand of Fiber for the People yarn on the Kid Mohair silk base in the Kick Drum colorway. It's really beautiful. I love it, but you'll notice that the raglan doesn't have any eyelets. It's just a basic raglan seam, really nice and neat. And I really like it. I like the kind of stitched together look. I don't know if you can see that in there, but that's just because of the way that I increased on either side of the marker. And so that is what I'm going to share with you, is how to get this clean raglan seam here, no eyelets, and it's going to simplify everything in terms of the short row shaping around the neck. It's just less to keep track of. So all you're going to do is knit to one stitch before the raglan marker, knit through the front and the back of that stitch, slip the marker, knit through the front and the back of the following stitch, and carry on with the rest of the sweater in that way. So, okay, one more time. You're going to knit to one stitch before the marker, knit through the front and the back of that stitch, slip the marker, knit through the front and the back of the next stitch, and continue that way throughout the whole round of the increases. You do that for your increase rounds only, followed by a knit round afterwards, because that's going to give you your increase round and your knit round. This information is going to be over on Ravelry in my project page for Felix number 3. I will link to all of that down below in the description box, but it's a really simple way to work around the eyelet increases if it's just not your thing. So I hope that helps. I know that short row shaping is complicated. I was asked to do a tutorial, and I mentioned that I might do some tutorials with short row shaping. Excuse me, I'm getting some fuzz. But what I will do is link to some really good tutorials down in the description box for you to check out, because there are so many short row shaping tutorials out there. But I think that maybe if the eyelets are giving you some trouble with the short row shaping, if this is your first sweater or you're just having issues, this workaround is a really good way to simplify things. I think you'll find that the short row shaping just becomes easier when you don't have to worry about the eyelet placement, because you're creating that like V, upside down V shape of eyelets. So hopefully this helps. Thank you so much for taking the time to check this out. Please leave me a comment down below if you have any questions, or if you'd like to add to this particular tutorial, if you will, if you have other tips for selecting a sweater size based on your gauge swatch. I would love to hear what you guys have to say. If you are participating in the Felix for Fall Cal, I am so excited to see your work. There are so many works in progress happening right now over on Instagram and on the Ravelry page. Definitely check it out. We have a hashtag Felix for Fall, KAL. And it's great. I'm just so inspired seeing all of the Felixes that you guys are working on. If you found this video useful, please hit the thumbs up button and don't forget to subscribe for more content. I will be back here for a podcast episode on Sunday. Until then, happy knitting, happy making, happy whatever it is that you're doing. I will see you soon. Bye.